Hi, I'm Jamie White. I'm Head of Technical SEO at Search Laboratory. Today I'm going to be running through all the different technical considerations that you need to take into account on your website when planning your international marketing strategy for SEO. Working with technical SEO on just one website can be quite a tricky situation. So if you throw a number of international sites into the mix, you can start to see how it could certainly build in terms of complexity. In terms of an agenda today, so some of the things that I'm going to be running through are different ways that you can structure your websites and set them up, but also different ways of structuring the content on those websites and some certain benefits and drawbacks of each approach. Running through the Hitraflang implementation, which is all about giving search engines more information about your content so they can serve the right content to the right users in the right markets. Looking at the Search Console, which many people will know previously was known as Webmaster Tools. So running through how you can set your websites up in there and give search engines, particularly Google, more information about your site and the types of users that you should be targeting. And then finally, looking through some common mistakes, common pitfalls that we have seen people fall into in the past and how you can avoid these going forward with your international strategies. So first off, just with regards to site structure, there's three main options or three main routes that we see people structuring websites in. And the first one would be the ccTLD, and this stands for country code top level domain. Examples that I've given here would target the UK, France and Germany. Could also take the subfolder approach. So everything's hosted on a generic domain such as example.com, and we've used subfolders for, again, UK, France and Germany. And then finally, we could take the subdomain approach. Again, everything's hosted on the generic.com, but everything's in a subdomain approach. So it's before example.com instead of afterwards in a subfolder. Now, there's no real right or wrong approach to taking either of these three options, but they certainly do have their pros and cons, and either will be more suitable to your situation as opposed to another. So I just thought I'd run through some of these in a bit more detail. So firstly, the ccTLD, so country code top level domain. An example of a company that uses this is Coca-Cola, as you can see in the top right there. And the main benefit of this is it's a really, really strong location signal, not just to Google, but to all search engines about the location of your website and the sorts of users that you should be targeting with your content. Another real benefit of this is a real trust factor amongst your audience. This is really beneficial. We've seen in the French market, French users are much more likely to click on a .fr website than they might be to click on a .com with a French subdomain or a French subfolder. That's just one example of a market that has a propensity to click on a local domain. Other markets, other industries, other users, that might not be too applicable to, but we have seen evidence in the past. In terms of drawbacks of this approach, so there are increasing sort of linking and promotional efforts required across all these domains. Because you're essentially setting up completely separate websites and completely separate domains, they don't all benefit from the ranking and link authority of one another unless you've set up some really strong internal linking processes. So you are going to have to do promotion, link activity and outreach across all your different domains in order to build them up to the level that you need them to be in order to rank in their respective search engine markets. And then finally, sort of one of the smaller drawbacks, but there is the increased cost, both monetary and also a time-based cost around purchasing, setting up and maintaining all of these websites separately because they are all on separate domains. The second approach would be the subfolder approach. So the example that you can see here is Apple, that they've used across some of their sites. And one of the real benefits of this approach is that the fact that the link authority of that top level domain, so in this case apple.com, the link authority that's been built up in that domain, in all of the different subfolders that we set up across that, they all benefit from that link authority. So it's quite a quick way to get into a new market, set up a subfolder on a website, and it will immediately start to benefit from some of that link authority, some of that outreach activity that you've done in the past on your top level domain. Another benefit of this, sort of on the flip side to the ccTLD approach, is that there's a much lower purchase and maintenance cost with regards to this approach. The cost itself is probably not going to be too huge anyway, but it is a certain benefit to this approach that you can take. And in terms of some drawbacks, so there might be a potentially lower trust factor for someone seeing a .com website in a local market, like to go back to our previous example of France. They may be less likely to click on your listing if it's a .com/fr than if it was example.com. Another slight drawback of this approach is it's a much weaker location signal to search engines compared to the ccTLD. So because everything's hosted on the .com, that is a generic domain. It's not specific to one country anywhere in the globe. So it's a much weaker location signal as to if you were to set up a French subfolder or a German subfolder, that doesn't give as much indication to Google as to the users that you want to target compared to if you were to have the country code top level domain for those sites. And then finally, moving on to the subdomain. So Wikipedia is a great example of a site that uses this approach, as you can see in the top right there. And this one really just sits in the middle of the previous two. So it doesn't really have the strong benefits of one or the really disadvantageous drawbacks of the other. So it sort of just sits in the middle of the two, and I'll explain why. So there is a bit of a location signal that you can give to search engines. So even though Wikipedia's example here is all hosted on wikipedia.org, which is a generic domain, not specific to one location, you could set up all the subdomains in different locations on different servers. So we could set up EN, DE, and PT in their respective countries on separate servers, which is a slight location signal that you can give to search engines. Finally, secondly, there's also a lower purchase and maintenance cost to set up the subdomains as opposed to purchase and set up the individual top-level domains. And then finally, there is some degree of sharing of that link authority of, in this example, wikipedia.org, but it's certainly not as beneficial as taking the subfolder approach in terms of sharing that link authority across those sites. So that's really why it sort of sits in the middle in terms of the benefits of the previous two examples. In terms of drawbacks of this approach, so there is some increasing linking and promotional efforts required because it doesn't benefit from all the link authority of that top-level domain, as I previously mentioned. And then it is a weaker location signal compared to the country code top-level domain. So this approach, it does have its benefits in terms of it doesn't have hugely strong drawbacks, but it doesn't have hugely strong benefits either. So it depends on your situation as to whether you'd like to adopt this approach. In terms of content structure, so two real main examples as to how you might see your website structured. You might have multiple single language content targeting different locations. An example of this would be if we were to have 4 pages of English content targeting 4 different countries. So in this example, Great Britain, Ireland, US, and Australia. This is a totally legitimate way of setting up the content on your website because we want to hit all these users with English content, but it might all be duplicated. So there are certain considerations we need to take into account. We might have completely translated content targeting completely different languages. So another example, we could have 4 pages of content, one in English, one in French, one in Italian, and one in Spanish. So these, in Google's eyes, they're completely separate pieces of content because the words on the page are not identical to one another, but they are translated. So this is a fairly common approach as well. So what we need to do when taking either of these approaches to setting up our content and setting up our websites, we need to give search engines a lot more information about this content so that they can understand exactly who we're wanting to target with our content on our web pages. And the way that we can do that is by using the Hitraflang tag. So this is quite purely a HTML tag that would appear in the head section of any web page's source code. So it has to be hard coded into the web page, and it has to be done at page level as well. So each individual piece of content, each individual page on your website has to have this code present if there are alternate versions in other languages. And really what we're doing here is we're helping Google and all the other search engines that we're wanting to target, we're helping them serve the correct content to the correct users in the correct market. Because if we were to take some of our previous examples, if we didn't have the country code top level domains for all our brands, if we were to host everything on a .com, that might not give Google enough of a strong location signal as to where our content actually needs to be targeted and the users that we're wanting to focus on. So again, the examples that I've previously run through, so we might have duplicate content with small language variations, so 4 pages of English content, perhaps with small variations for price or delivery options, certain currencies and things like that. Or we might just have fully translated content in multiple languages, and we have to use the Hitraflang tag for either of these instances if they're present on our website. So to go through some of these examples in a bit more detail, so if we've got duplicate content with some small language variations, an example of this might be our widgets page in Great Britain, in Ireland, in USA, and in Australia. And we've got Googlebot in the middle there, and it's sort of come up against a bit of a problem because it's thinking, I've got 4 pages of English content here. Which of these pages should I actually rank for the keyword widgets in the respective markets? And I suppose one of the issues that Google might, or sort of one of the solutions that Google might apply to this problem, is just picking one of the pieces of content and ranking it in all markets. We certainly don't want this. We don't want our British targeted piece of content appearing in USA and vice versa, because there may be some crucial changes with regards to the content that makes it not applicable to that user. Another more drastic approach that Googlebot might take is sort of not being able to decide which of these it should actually rank in the relevant market, and discarding your content and picking some content from a competitor brand in the market or in the search results. That's obviously not what we want. So what we want to make sure is that we're giving Google and all the search engines enough information about our content so it can rank it accordingly based on the user's language query and, if appropriate, based on their actual country of location. So what we can do, we can actually use the Hitraflang code, and this is an example of how the code would actually appear on our web page for example.com. So we've got our page for Great Britain, for Ireland, Australia and USA. What I thought I'd do here is I'd just break this down so we can understand exactly what we're doing and what we're telling search engines with this piece of code. So first off, we're saying with this rel equals alternate tag, we're saying there are alternate versions of this piece of content elsewhere, alternate versions in different languages that we want you to take into account when ranking our content. What we're doing here is we're saying exactly where these alternate versions are located. So we've just listed all the different links to all the different pieces of content. And then finally, we're saying this is the language of the content. So they're all in English in this case. And then lastly, we're saying it's specifically for users in this country. So what Google's reaction to this is it knows exactly what we're doing with these 4 duplicate pieces of English content. One's for the UK, one's for Ireland, one's for Australia, and one's for the USA. So we've given it a lot more information, and it can go out there and it can rank the piece of content accordingly in local search engines. A couple of points to note, I guess, about this code is that the language tag is a required tag. So the Hitraflang code its pure sense is just to indicate the language of a piece of content. So that is a required tag. So in this case, we've said they're all in English, which is fine. The optional tag here is to focus it on a specific country. We obviously want to do it in this case because we've got 4 pieces of English content. Google won't be able to rank those correctly without a bit more information, so we've broken it down to the specific country level. But I'll give you an example on one of the next slides about how we might not actually break this down to specific country level. So our other option was to use fully translated content in multiple languages. This is probably a very, very common approach for people in the room. So we've got our widgets page on our English or British site, French, Italian and Spanish site. And we've got Googlebot in the middle, and if we're hosting this all on the same website, it's not necessarily got enough information to rank these pieces of content accordingly, because there's not enough location signals behind our generic website to say this page is for France, this is for Spain, this is for the UK, etc. So again, we can use the Hitraflang code to give it more information. So again, we've got the exact same breakdown, the alternate links, where they're located. And in this case, we've just specified the language. So we've said that the first link is for English, second for French, third for Spanish, and fourth for Italian. And that's for those exact users searching in that language. Those English users, they might not be in Great Britain, and the French users might not be in France. But we're just saying that for any person searching in that language, this is the piece of content that we want you to serve them. So as you can see, we've just specified the language in that case. We could expand that out, and we could include a country code as well. So what we're doing here, we're being much more specific. So as we're saying, English users in the UK, French in France, Spanish in Spain, and Italian in Italy. So we're being more specific. We've added that extra bit of country code to make it more specific, and Google can start to understand exactly where it should rank the content and against which query in which language. You could also get what I'm calling bonus points in Hitraflang. So you could use the Hitraflang command XDefault. And this is for content that's not specific to one language. So a good example or scenario when you might use this is for on like a country selector page or any kind of catch-all content that isn't actually relevant to English users, it's not relevant to French users. So if we wanted to land all our visitors on this country selector page so that they could go off and then find their respective country or respective language site, we'd use the tag XDefault, and the code at the bottom there if everyone can see it. So we've specified our page, which is example.com/world. So this is our world catch-all page, and the language that we've specified is XDefault. And this is a recognized code by Google, and Google's interpretation of this is basically it's anyone who's not satisfied by all the other criteria. So if we've specified a page for our English users and all our other language users that we want to target, and then we've got everyone else in the world that we don't know exactly where to land them, we can use the XDefault tag, and that will basically catch all these other users and land them on a page that we want to land them on. It doesn't have to be a country selector page. It doesn't have to be a page with a generic piece of content. If we want to land them on the UK site or the US site, that's fine. We just have to make it clear in the Hitraflang code where we actually want to land those users, and it's all going to be on a case-by-case and situation-by-situation basis based on your company's needs, definitely. So moving on to the Google Search Console, just a couple of points about this. So yeah, as I say, previously known as Webmaster Tools, most people will still call it this, but the official term now is Google Search Console. And what we can do here, we can set up a profile in Search Console for all our different target websites. So if we've got websites for all these different countries, we can set up a profile for each one of them. And this is the functionality that we see within Search Console. So we could tick that box and basically say we want to target users in, and then pick a country from the list. So this is really beneficial. If we've got a .com website, that's a generic domain, so that's not associated with any country in the world. But if we only want to target users in the US, or only want to target users in the UK, we can set it up in Search Console, click the box, pick the country, and that's an immediate location signal to Google about the users that we want to target with our content. A couple of points to note, I guess. So ccTLDs, such as these examples here, Google in Search Console will auto-detect the target country. So we have to target the UK with our .co.uk website because it's such a strong location signal, and that's obviously the users that we're wanting to target. It can be done at any kind of level. So it could be done at domain level, so on a .com. It could be done at subdomain level, so if we've got fr.oursite.com, and the subfolder level, so oursite.com/fr. We can set up a profile for any one of these websites in Search Console and be really specific with the types of users and the country that we actually want to target our content towards. A final point to note is don't do this if you're wanting to target your content to multiple countries. So if you've got a page of French content and you actually want to target French speakers in France and in Canada or any other French-speaking country, don't set up your website in Search Console and click this box and click France, because you'll seriously limit your coverage in any other kind of countries, and you might miss out on a lot of traffic that you might actually want to take advantage of. So that's just a short piece about Google Search Console and how you can use that to give Google much greater location signals about your content. So moving on to some of the common pitfalls, common mistakes that we actually see live on sites that we take on, clients that we take on, and elsewhere in the industry. The first one, quite a blatant one, is not implementing Hitraflang at page level. This must be done. It is a page level command. It shouldn't just sit on the home page or shouldn't just sit on one page of your website. It has to be at page level. So an example here would be the code that we might use on our home page for all our different websites, and then an example of the code that we might use on this page, so page1.html. And as you can see, I've referenced in the alternate links the exact version and exactly where it sits. So I've not just used the code on the home page and expected that to be rolled out across the website. I've used it on individual page level, and this is something that definitely must be done. Another common error that I sometimes see is trying to target groups of users, so specific continents or specific regions. So an example might be setting up a website that you want to target European users for. Now, Europe's not actually a recognized country or location in terms of an ISO code, so we couldn't use this in the Hitraflang. What we could do, we could use Hitraflang EN, in which we're saying all English users or all English speakers, we want to land on our European site, or we could use the XDefault. But what we're risking here is we may gather any kind of non-EU traffic. So if we've got an English speaker in America and we've used Hitraflang EN for our European site, they're probably going to land on our European site unless we're more specific elsewhere. So this is certainly something to take into account. So I've sort of just shown the code as something that you might not want to use. So this example here, we've tried to target our European page to English speakers in Europe. That's not something that we can do because that piece of code will not be recognized by Google. A good example that you might want to do, you could just target it to all English speakers, or you might want to use it as the XDefault, and either of those are acceptable practices. But what I would typically recommend is probably steering away from any kind of European or continental or regional based website or subfolder, because it can become so tricky in terms of setting up the Hitraflang and the targeting for these websites. So another common mistake that we do sometimes see is missing return links. So whenever you specify an alternate piece of content in your Hitraflang, that alternate URL must then reference the original piece of content back, so they must coordinate with one another in terms of returning the Hitraflang code. So going into another example, if we've got our homepage of our GB website with this piece of code, And then this is the code that we've used on our France website. There's clearly a problem here because we've not actually included the return tag for the GB code. I'll just go back a step there. So you can see that we've only got the 3 references. If we just put that one in, then that's fine because we've put the exact direct link back. And again, that has to be done at page level for every piece of content. One thing to note, only do this when an alternate piece of content exists. If the alternate piece of content doesn't exist on one of your regional sites, that's fine. There's no problem for Google. There's no duplication of content for it to get concerned about. So you don't need to reference any alternate page because quite frankly, there's no alternate page for you to actually reference there. Some of the other common errors that we see people running into, specifying the country and not the language. So Hitraflang is a language tag. Language is a requirement. Country is only optional. So this example here, we're trying to target these 2 pieces of content to GB and to US. We can't do this because these aren't recognized language codes. They're recognized country codes, but we're not giving Google an indication about the language of the piece of content. These are actually fine because even though they are country code, they're also recognized language codes as well for that specific language. So those 3 would be fine, but the top 2 wouldn't be. So always specify the language. Country is always optional, but sometimes is actually required. Another sort of pitfall that we sometimes see people landing into is redirecting users based on IP address. Now this sounds perfect, and for usability point of view, it is. But in terms of SEO and Google crawling your website, it sort of hits a brick wall essentially. So to sort of display this, if we've got our user in Italy and they try and access our UK page, we detect their IP address, see that they're located in Italy, and redirect them to the Italian page. Now, if we think about Google, which conducts the majority of its crawls out of the US, this is the issue that Google is going to find. It's going to try and crawl that UK page. We're going to redirect it to the US page, which means that it can't crawl the UK page and it can't crawl any of these other pages as well. Google will start to crawl from outside of the US, but now majoritively it is all within the US. So this is a big issue for any websites that conduct this sort of practice, and it's something that we'd certainly steer away from. Another common pitfall is dynamic serving of content based on location. So again, it could be IP address, cookie, or any kind of login details. So to sort of visualize this, it is typically served on one URL. So we've got our Italian user trying to access this page, which is /page.html. We detect where they're located and we show them Italian content. But what we're doing is we're showing them Italian content on the exact same URL. Google can only see one URL and it will only see the content that is there originally, which will be the English content. So Google will never see that Italian content. It won't have a page for Italy and you won't be able to rank in Italy with this approach, frankly. So that's certainly something to avoid. Another sort of common error, poor internal linking. So make sure as best as possible that all your international websites and all your international content are strongly internally linked. Not just so that search engines can find the content, but also so that they can pass authority through as well. So if we've got a lot of authority built up in our UK website and we launch a French website and an Italian website, if we set up some links to those sites, immediately some authority is going to be passed through from all that link building and link acquisition activity that we've done previously. So to go back to the examples from the beginning, Apple and Coca-Cola both do this really well. So Apple have this sort of select a country page where you can just click on a country. Google can find these sites really easily. It can pass authority through and they're really good for users as well. Coca-Cola takes a similar approach, so with a lot more countries and a lot more regions that they target. So I guess just to summarize the points that I've gone through today. So duplicate content for different countries, use Hitraflang. If we've got translated content for different languages in different countries, use Hitraflang. Any kind of duplication of content or across different languages, you should be using this kind of tag. Avoid redirection based on dynamic content or based on location. You're really restricting search engines' crawling of this content, and it could restrict the amount of visibility that you actually gain in international markets. Make sure that your content can be found through internal linking. So the examples that I showed, Apple and Coca-Cola, do this really, really well. So make sure that all your sites are hooked up together and associated with one another. And then finally, make the most of Google Search Console. Give more geo-targeting and more location signals to Google in terms of how your content should be structured and the users that you should be targeting. I think I've pretty much gone up to time, so if everyone could save questions to the panel at the end.